My name is Della. I'm 72. I live alone now in a house near the lake, the one where the wind always whispers secrets through the pines. The day of the funeral was a blur of muted colors and hushed voices, a solemn ballet performed by people who barely knew him, yet felt obligated to mourn. I sat in the front pew, my black dress a heavy shroud, the scent of lilies and sorrow thick in the air. My gaze was fixed on the polished wood of the casket, trying to find some trace of the man I had loved for 50 years, the man who was now just a memory, a silence. Then she arrived, not a quiet, respectful entrance, but a rustle of silk and a faint, cloying perfume that cut through the lilies. My niece, Clara. She slid into the pew beside me, her presence an abrupt jolt in the quiet solemnity. I hadn't seen her in years, not since the last family gathering where her laughter, too loud and too bright, had grated on my nerves. She was wearing a deep, almost vampy shade of red lipstick, a color my husband Arthur had always detested. "Makes a woman look like a painted doll," he'd grumbled once, long ago, when he'd seen it on a stranger. I remembered that clear as day, even as my mind struggled to grasp the reality of his absence. Clara leaned in, her voice a low murmur that still managed to carry in the hushed space. "So sorry for your loss, Aunt Della," she whispered. Her eyes, however, flitted around the room, taking in the faces, the floral arrangements, everything but the casket or me. Her hand, perfectly manicured, reached out and briefly squeezed my arm. There was no warmth in the touch, only a fleeting, perfunctory gesture. It was then, as my gaze drifted from her bright red lips to her indifferent eyes, that a tiny fracture appeared within me. A hairline crack, so fine it was almost imperceptible, but it was there. It wasn't just the lipstick or the insincere whisper. It was the way she held herself, as if this entire sorrowful tableau was merely a backdrop for her own fleeting appearance. It was the subtle tilt of her head, the almost imperceptible smirk that played on her lips when she thought no one was looking, as if she knew something, some secret joke that only she was privy to. I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, despite the stuffy warmth of the church. It wasn't the chill of grief, but something colder, sharper. It was the chilling realization that some people, even family, see tragedy not as a shared sorrow, but as an opportunity, a shift in the landscape that might somehow benefit them. Arthur had always been the rock, the steadying presence. His passing, I suddenly understood, had created a vacuum that others were already, subconsciously, trying to fill. Clara, with her bright lipstick and detached gaze, was simply the first to reveal her hand. I looked back at Arthur lying so still, so peaceful. He wouldn't have noticed the lipstick, not now, but I did. And in that moment, a quiet resolve settled within me, a seed planted in the fertile ground of my sorrow. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something far more subtle, more enduring. It was the understanding that my silence, my quiet grief, was being misread. It was being perceived as weakness, as an open door, but they were wrong. My silence was merely the precursor to something else, something they wouldn't see coming. I kissed his cool forehead, a final tender goodbye. And as I straightened, a subtle shift occurred within me. I was no longer just the grieving widow. I was a woman who had just seen a glimpse of the sharks circling, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would not be their prey. I left the church, the vibrant, soft rose shade of lipstick that Arthur had loved, the one I had worn for him countless times, still tucked discreetly in my purse. If this story echoes something buried in you, a quiet like or subscribe helps keep these voices from fading. After the funeral, the silence descended, thick and suffocating. But it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of absence, of a space carved out where a vibrant life once resided. Arthur's belongings, his pipe resting on the bedside table, the newspaper half read on his favorite armchair, became monuments to his absence. Each object whispered his name, a constant, gentle torment. But the true silence, the one that truly began to eat at me, was the silence from the very people who should have been there. My family. For decades, Arthur and I had been the anchor of our small family. We hosted holidays, mediated disputes, offered an open door and a listening ear. Our home was a hub, a place of laughter and comfort, a place where everyone knew they were welcome. But with Arthur gone, it was as if the gravitational pull had ceased to exist. Calls became fewer, visits non-existent. My nieces and nephews, who once flocked to our house for Christmas and summer barbecues, seemed to have forgotten the address. My sister, Evelyn, Arthur's only surviving sibling, called occasionally, but her conversations were brief, punctuated by polite inquiries about my well-being that felt more like a formality than genuine concern. She always seemed to be in a hurry, rushing off to some engagement that clearly superseded her widowed sister-in-law. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional stark reminder of my dwindling relevance. One afternoon, Clara called, not to check on me, but to ask if she could borrow some of Arthur's old books. "He had such a good collection, Aunt Della," she chirped, her voice light and airy. "I remember the Shakespeare volumes." I told her they were packed away, which was a lie. They sat on his study shelves, untouched, gathering dust. The truth was, I couldn't bear to part with them, not yet. But her request wasn't about the books. It was about staking a claim, an unspoken declaration of ownership over what was once his. Another time, Evelyn casually mentioned in a phone call that the family was planning a small gathering for my grandniece's birthday. "Oh, we thought it would be better if it was just the younger ones this time," she said, almost as an afterthought. "You know, more lively." The sting was sharp, immediate. I was suddenly too old, too slow, too much of a reminder of what they had lost, or perhaps what they simply didn't want to deal with. I was being gently, politely pushed to the periphery, a fading photograph in their vibrant, fast-paced lives. The worst was the subtle erasure of my own name. Family stories, once told with me as a central figure, began to be retold with me, relegated to a secondary character, or worse, entirely absent. "Remember when Arthur and we went to the coast?" Evelyn would say, when it had clearly been Arthur and I. The small, everyday memories, the fabric of our shared history, were being rewoven without my thread. It was as if my identity, so long intertwined with Arthur's and with the family we had built, was slowly dissolving, leaving behind a ghost in my own home. I would sit by the window watching the lake shimmer under the changing light and feel a profound loneliness settle over me. It wasn't just the absence of Arthur, but the creeping realization that I was becoming invisible. My voice, which had once been heard and respected, now felt unheard, unneeded. My opinions once sought were now overlooked. I was no longer Della, the vibrant, witty woman who had managed a bustling home and contributed equally to every decision. I was just Arthur's widow, a quiet, aging presence who was best left undisturbed, a relic of a past they were eager to move beyond. This silence, this gradual erasure, was a grief far more insidious than the initial shock of losing Arthur. That grief was sharp, immediate, a searing wound, but this was a slow bleed, a quiet diminishment that chipped away at my sense of self, leaving me feeling hollowed out, unmoored. I was fading, not into the tranquility of old age, but into the oblivion of being forgotten by the very people who had once called me family. And in that deep, echoing silence, a quiet anger began to stir, a slow, deliberate ember that glowed in the darkness. The cost of that silence was immeasurable, a slow erosion of everything I thought I was. It wasn't just the visible things, the empty chair at the dinner table, the quiet evenings once filled with Arthur's gentle humming. It was the internal landscape that shifted, cracked, and began to crumble. My sense of self, once so firmly rooted in my roles as wife, mother figure, family matriarch, withered under the neglect. I had always been Della, the one who remembered birthdays, who baked the perfect pie, who offered a calm voice in a crisis. Now I was just Della, the woman who lived alone in a house too big for one, her memories fading, her purpose undefined. My voice, once clear and confident, began to waver. I found myself hesitating before speaking, replaying conversations in my head, wondering if what I had to say truly mattered. More often than not, I decided it didn't. The fear of being dismissed, of being met with that polite, detached indifference, became a heavy cloak I wore everywhere. I started to communicate less, withdrawing into myself, finding solace in the quiet hum of the refrigerator or the rustle of leaves outside my window. The phone, once a lifeline, became a source of anxiety. I let it ring, watching the caller ID flash, knowing it would likely be a telemarketer or a distant relative making a perfunctory check-in, rather than someone genuinely interested in my day. The youth I once possessed, the vibrancy that had drawn Arthur to me, felt like a distant dream. I saw reflections of myself in the mirror, a woman with lines etched around her eyes, hair thinned and silvered, and felt a disconnect. Where was the woman who once danced freely in the living room with her husband, her laughter echoing through the halls? She was gone, replaced by this quiet, cautious figure. It wasn't just the physical aging, it was the premature aging of my spirit, brought on by the steady drip of emotional neglect. I felt like a faded photograph, losing its color and definition with each passing year, each forgotten invitation, each unheard word. But perhaps the greatest cost was the erosion of my trust. I had believed in the inherent goodness of family, in the unspoken pact of support and love. That belief, so deeply ingrained, was now fractured. I looked at Clara, with her bright lipstick and her calculating eyes, and saw not just a self-absorbed young woman, but a symbol of a deeper betrayal. She represented the willingness of others to step over you, to diminish you for their own perceived gain. The world, which I had always viewed as a generally benevolent place, now seemed a little colder, a little more self-serving. Every interaction, every polite smile felt tainted by a subtle undercurrent of suspicion. I found myself dissecting words, searching for hidden meanings, for the unspoken implications that might further chip away at my dwindling sense of security. Arthur, in his quiet way, had been the guardian of my trust. His unwavering presence, his consistent love, had been the foundation upon which I built my world. With him gone, and with the subsequent retreat of my family, that foundation felt shaky, exposed to the harsh winds of indifference. The grief for his physical absence remained, a constant ache, but it was overshadowed by a new, more pervasive sorrow. The grief for the loss of my own self, the loss of my place in the world, and the shattering of my faith in the unyielding bonds of family. I would sit in the garden, once a source of immense joy, and feel a hollowness that even the blooming roses couldn't fill. The vibrant colors seemed duller, the bird song less melodic. The quiet used to be a comfort. Now it was a constant reminder of what was missing. The cost was clear, a profound and isolating loneliness, a quiet despair that settled deep in my bones. I was a ship adrift, no longer guided by the lighthouse of love and belonging. The turning point wasn't a sudden explosion or a dramatic revelation. It was a slow, glacial shift, like the earth itself realigning its plates. The silence, which had once been a shroud of sorrow, began to transform. It stopped being a testament to my fading presence and started to become a shield, then a weapon. It was born from a quiet fury, an ember that had been glowing in the depths of my being, now fanned by the constant breeze of their indifference. It started subtly. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring. I stopped anticipating visits that never materialized. The invitations that never came were no longer a source of pain, but a confirmation of their neglect. And with that confirmation came a strange, exhilarating sense of liberation. If they weren't going to include me, then I was no longer beholden to their expectations. The energy I had spent yearning for their acknowledgement, for a return to the way things were, began to redirect itself. The first tangible shift came when I found myself looking through old photo albums, not the curated, smiling family portraits, but the candid shots, the ones that captured genuine moments. There, in a faded picture from a summer picnic, was Arthur, laughing, his arm around my waist, while Clara, then a gangly teenager, stood a few feet away, her expression a mix of boredom and disdain. I remembered that day vividly. Clara had complained about the heat, about the food, about everything. Arthur had gently, patiently, tried to cheer her up, while I, then caught up in the moment, had barely noticed her sour demeanor. But now, looking at the image with the clarity of hindsight, I saw it. The faint shadow of something unkind, something self-serving, even then. It was in that moment, seeing the pattern emerge from the forgotten details, that I understood. Their neglect wasn't just about Arthur's absence. It was a continuation of something that had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to assert itself. My quiet, accommodating nature had been misinterpreted not as strength, but as malleability. My love, given freely, had been taken for granted, and my sorrow, instead of eliciting empathy, had become an inconvenience. The realization settled deep within me, cold and firm. I wasn't just a grieving widow. I was a woman who had been consistently overlooked, undervalued, and now quietly erased. And the silence, their silence, was the canvas upon which I would begin to repaint my own story. I started to observe them, not with longing, but with a detached, almost scientific curiosity. I listened to the infrequent phone calls, catching nuances in their voices, hints of their plans, their aspirations, their vulnerabilities. I paid attention to the casual remarks, the offhand comments, gathering fragments of information like a meticulous collector. I began to tend my garden again, not out of duty, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Each plant I nurtured, each weed I pulled, was an act of reclaiming, a silent declaration of my own agency. The earth, cool and forgiving beneath my hands, grounded me. I started to read again, not the light novels I used to enjoy, but books on history, on strategy, on the subtle art of influence. My mind, once dulled by grief and neglect, sharpened. I started to see connections, to piece together the unspoken narratives that govern their lives. The world outside my window, once a blurry backdrop to my sorrow, became a vibrant tapestry of possibilities. The quiet of my house, once a source of profound loneliness, transformed into a sanctuary, a strategic command center. I was no longer waiting to be remembered. I was remembering myself. And with that reclamation came a profound, quiet strength. The silence was no longer a void. It was fertile ground. And in that fertile ground, the seeds of a new kind of reckoning, a precise and deliberate, quiet action, began to take root. The tears stopped, replaced by a steely glint in my eyes. The turning had begun. The revenge was not born of malice, but of a quiet, unyielding justice. It wasn't about inflicting pain, but about restoring balance, about rewriting the narrative they thought they'd already penned. It was a surgical strike, precise and invisible, designed to rearrange the ground beneath them so subtly they wouldn't notice until their footing was gone. My first target, perhaps inevitably, was Clara. She had inherited a small, almost insignificant plot of land from her father, a distant cousin of Arthur's who had died years ago. It was a neglected patch of marshland near the lake, deemed worthless by everyone, including Clara, who had often scoffed at the swampy inheritance. But I knew something they didn't. Arthur, in his methodical way, had once researched the old property deeds for a historical society project. He discovered that a forgotten, unrecorded easement ran directly through Clara's marshland, granting access to a secluded, untouched spring on the other side. A spring whose waters, due to a unique mineral composition, were highly prized by a niche bottling company looking to expand into boutique health drinks. I spent weeks researching, meticulously sifting through old county records, confirming the easement's validity. It was obscure, buried deep in forgotten archives, but it was legally binding. Then quietly, I reached out to the bottling company, posing as a local historian interested in the lake's ecological history. I casually mentioned the unique spring, hinting at its potential, always careful not to reveal too much, allowing them to draw their own conclusions. Their interest, as I had predicted, was immediate and keen. They were already looking for new water sources, and this one, with its unique mineral profile, was a hidden gem. Next, I found a retired discreet land agent known for his ability to navigate complex property disputes. I explained the situation vaguely, emphasizing the undiscovered nature of the spring and the obscure easement. He understood immediately. Within months, under the guise of an environmental conservation effort, the bottling company began quietly acquiring the land surrounding Clara's marsh. Their offers were generous but calculated, just enough to tempt the unsuspecting landowners without raising alarm bells. Clara, seeing her neighbors suddenly receiving unexpected windfalls for their worthless land began to take notice. The climax of my act came when the bottling company approached Clara directly, offering a substantial sum for her marshland. They cited the new access road they planned to build, which would, coincidentally, run directly through her property, thanks to the old easement. Clara, seeing dollar signs, was thrilled. She bragged to Evelyn about her unexpected good fortune, crowing about finally getting something valuable from her useless inheritance. She signed the papers without a second thought, eager for the quick profit. What she didn't know, what no one else knew, was the true value of the easement. By selling the land with the easement still attached, she had unwittingly signed away the only viable access to the spring. The bottling company, advised by their shrewd lawyers and subtly guided by my initial inquiries, then purchased the water rights to the spring from the actual owner, an elderly, reclusive man who had no idea of its true worth, for a pittance. Clara received a decent sum for her marshland, certainly more than she thought it was worth, but she sold it just before the spring's true value was made public, missing out on millions. The final exquisite touch was the choice of lipstick. As she signed the papers, I imagined her, in her mind's eye, applying that same garish red. But for Arthur, I made sure she wore the shade he truly loved. I had purchased a small, exquisite compact of the exact rose petal shade he adored, and on the day she signed the contract, I sent it to her anonymously with a small, elegant note that simply read, "For a new beginning." Clara, ever superficial, probably thought it was a random gift, a token from a secret admirer. She likely applied it without a second thought, the soft, flattering color a stark contrast to the sharp, detached gleam in her eyes. She had rearranged the family tree by erasing my name. I had rearranged her financial landscape, quietly, permanently. There was no confrontation, no dramatic reveal, just a subtle shift in the tectonic plates of their lives, initiated by my silent hand. And by the time she fully grasped the enormity of what she'd relinquished, the silence had already claimed her, leaving her standing on ground that was no longer solid beneath her feet. The shift was imperceptible to them, a slow, quiet settling of dust after a tremor they never felt. Clara, with her new, albeit limited wealth from the marshland sale, continued her life, blissfully unaware of the true scale of the fortune she'd forfeited. She bought a new car, took a lavish vacation, and posted endless pictures of her success online. Her satisfaction, however, felt brittle, a thin veneer over something fundamentally missed. I would hear snippets from Evelyn, always delivered with a faint undercurrent of envy, about Clara's newfound spending habits. Evelyn never knew the half of it. No one screamed. No one pointed fingers. There were no accusations, no dramatic confrontations. How could there be? The instruments of my quiet revenge were entirely legal, meticulously orchestrated, and utterly untraceable back to me. The bottling company flourished, their miracle spring water becoming a sensation, their profits soaring. The small, unassuming patch of marshland Clara had once owned was now a bustling, industrialized site, its transformation a stark monument to her unwitting transaction. The irony was a bitter yet satisfying flavor on my tongue. The balance had shifted, irrevocably. They had sought to diminish me, to make me invisible, to erase my name from their casual narratives, but I had, in turn, rearranged their reality, not with destruction, but with a precise recalibration of their perceived fortunes. They continued their lives, confident in their small victories, oblivious to the deeper current that had pulled them subtly off course. They were still moving forward, but on a trajectory I had quietly set. The most profound release, however, was my own. The heavy cloak of invisibility I had worn for so long began to shed. The quiet despair that had settled in my bones lifted, replaced by a profound sense of calm. It wasn't triumph, not in the triumphant celebratory sense. It was something deeper, more enduring. It was the quiet satisfaction of a task meticulously completed, of a silent promise kept to myself. I walked through my garden, now lush and vibrant, feeling the earth firm beneath my feet. The roses seemed to bloom with greater intensity, their fragrance richer. The lake, once a symbol of my solitude, now reflected the vast open sky mirroring the newfound expanse within me. I was no longer defined by their neglect, by their silence. I was defined by my own quiet strength, by the unwavering resolve that had seen me through the darkest days. My voice, which had faltered and retreated, began to find its strength again, not to shout, but to speak with quiet authority. I started volunteering at the local library, sharing my love of history and literature with eager young minds. I joined a book club, engaging in lively discussions, my opinions sought and valued. I cooked for myself again, not just simple meals, but the intricate recipes Arthur had loved, savoring each flavor, each memory, no longer shrouded in sorrow but bathed in a gentle, warm light. The old photographs, once painful reminders of what was lost, now became cherished artifacts, testaments to a life well lived, a love that endured beyond death. I looked at Arthur's picture, his kind eyes smiling back at me, and felt a profound peace. I hadn't just avenged a wrong. I had reclaimed myself. I didn't need to say a word to anyone. The silent reckoning was complete. The ground beneath them had shifted, and I, Della, the quiet woman near the lake, was finally, irrevocably free.